Dobar dan, poštovani gledaoci i uvaženi slušaoci. Pratite ekskluzivno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Naš gost je ambasador Volker, bivši specijalni izaslanik Sjedinjenih Američkih Država za Ukrajinu i bivši ambasador pri NATO-u. Ambassador Volker, welcome to Podgorica and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, as we speak, the battles are raging in the east of Ukraine in the Donbas region. For Moscow, the quote-unquote liberation of this region is top priority. Now, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has suggested that Ukraine make territorial concessions to Russia in order to end the conflict, which President Zelensky has rejected, has even said that Kissinger is out of touch, so to speak. Is this kind of solution possible? Will Zelensky budge on this?
Yeah, I think it is, frankly, very unhelpful and very embarrassing for Henry Kissinger to say that. As President Zelensky said, the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, for their homes, for their country, and this is an unprovoked war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, and there should be no reward for aggression. Imagine if in other wars people had said, well, you know, France should just give up Alsace and Lorraine, you know, Germany should have them. Or as people did with Munich, with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, saying, oh, we can give that to Germany. This is always a recipe for disaster, and there's no basis for it. Now, what's happened, and I think it's important to lay this out a little bit, Putin had been waging a war against Ukraine for 8 years already, but it was a low-level conflict located really only in the Donbas region and Crimea. He launched a massive invasion of Ukraine in order to try to wipe out Ukraine as a country, to eliminate Ukraine's nationhood and Ukraine's identity as a people. And this is a form of cleansing, such as we've seen in the Balkans, that Putin was embarked on in Ukraine. The Ukrainians fought back, stopped Putin's offensive trying to take over Kyiv and Chernihiv and Sumy and Odessa and pushed it back. Now Russia has been forced to withdraw and regroup only in eastern Ukraine, where they are now trying again to take over all of the east. They may make some minor gains, but they're not going to succeed even in taking all of eastern Ukraine. And they've demonstrated that their military is far less capable than any of us thought. And they are not fighting for their country or their homeland or for anything that they believe in, whereas the Ukrainians are. So all of the motivation and the determination is on the side of Ukraine. And having fought the Russians off, having seen the war crimes and the atrocities that the Russians have committed in Ukraine, indiscriminate killing of civilians, execution of civilians, bombing of hospitals, raping of women, killing of children, absolutely outrageous war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. The Ukrainians will never accept to give away territory. And remember, if you give away territory, you're giving away the people who live on that territory. And they'll be subjected to the same atrocities that we already saw in other parts of Ukraine. So there's no way that President Zelensky or any Ukrainian president could ever agree to this.
So you think even if it were to happen, it would be completely unsustainable?
The people of Ukraine would never accept that some of their compatriots would be subject to those sorts of horrors. They want to fight back and have their country back.
While the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO is used by Moscow as pretext for an invasion, Russia seems to have less issue when it comes to their other neighbor, Finland, along with Sweden. These countries have made the historic move to join the alliance. And while at first we've seen President Putin make some harsh comments about it, we have seen some change in this attitude with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying that he is not surprised and that nothing will fundamentally change. Why this discrepancy? Why is Ukraine different, if not more important, to Russia?
So first off, the assertion that Ukraine's movement towards NATO or NATO movement into Ukraine is the reason for the war is a lie. It's a made-up reason by Putin because he wanted to invade Ukraine, because he wants to exterminate Ukraine as a country and call it part of Russia. So NATO membership is just a device. It has nothing to do with reality. When it is a reality, such as Finland saying we're going to join NATO, it clearly doesn't matter very much. It's not about that. When President Zelensky said Ukraine doesn't have to join NATO, we can be a neutral country, did that cause Putin to stop the war? No. He wanted to take over Ukraine anyway. So we have to recognize that this is not about NATO. It's about Russia seeking to take over its neighbor, and the Ukrainians fighting back against that. The other thing about Finland and Sweden saying they're going to join NATO is Russia knows they can't do anything about it. They are strong countries, they're members of the European Union, they can defend themselves already. Russia is already militarily challenged trying to take over Ukraine. There's nothing they can do to stop Finland and Sweden, so they don't want to embarrass themselves by opposing it too publicly.
So you believe it was just an excuse?
Yes.
Well, the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, well known for his controversial statements, to say the least, he has practically warned that Poland is next. Now, what are the real dangers of this, of the war spilling over into other countries, especially given that Poland is a member of NATO?
Well, first off, Kadyrov is not in charge of Russia, at least not yet. Second, the Russians generally, and maybe Kadyrov is in this category, say things in order to influence. So when they say things, don't pay attention to what they're saying, ask yourself why they're saying it. So why would Kadyrov be saying that Poland is next? Because he wants to threaten Poland to prevent them from helping Ukraine, because their help to Ukraine is actually making a difference. So Poland's help as a logistics hub, helping to supply weapons to Ukraine, providing moral support to Ukraine, hosting millions of displaced persons from Ukraine. Ukrainian refugees have had to flee Russia's onslaught. Hosting all of these people. This is something that Russia doesn't want to see because it weakens Russia's effort. And so that's why they're threatening Poland. Are they really intending to attack Poland, a NATO country, and really planning to have NATO join the side of fighting on behalf of Ukraine in order to defend themselves? I don't think so.
Well, most European, most Western countries have imposed sanctions on Russia, but there are some exceptions, and one of them is our neighbor, Serbia. Now, President Vučić has been hesitant, if not reluctant, to impose any kind of sanctions and damage the relationship that they have. And on the other hand, Russia has said that they will not stop supplying gas to Serbia. How do you interpret this relationship between Moscow and Belgrade?
Well, I think Belgrade has some unresolved historical issues in the region, and they still have a sense that Serbian nationalism is important to promote, and they use that to advance a Serbia first, sense in the region, not unlike Russia with its neighbors. And there's an influence of Russian leadership on Serbia, an influence of the Russian church on the Serbian church. And so this is something that Vučić feels and wants to protect, and I think he does get benefits from Russia for adopting these positions. But let's be clear, all of the European Union has said that Russia's unprovoked invasion and war crimes in Ukraine are an affront to our values and our interests, and we will impose sanctions against Russia until they get out of Ukraine again. And if a country hopes to be building relationship with Europe, to ultimately be a candidate for European EU membership, going against EU sanctions and undermining their impact on what the EU is trying to do is exactly the wrong way to get closer to the European Union.
Well, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, is due to visit Belgrade next week and to meet with President Vučić. What could we expect from that meeting?
Well, it is about the symbolism of Serbia showing that it's close to Russia, despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russia showing that it's not alone in the world. Despite the US and European sanctions, there are still one country or two who might still sit down with them. You will not find any other European leader at the moment wanting to have a meeting with Lavrov. It's the last photo they want.
Well, and when President Putin met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he recalled the decision of the International Court of Justice on the situation in Kosovo and used it as pretext to justify the Russian occupation of the region of Donbass. And he also said that was the precedent that has been created so that the republics of Lugansk and Donetsk can declare sovereignty. Now, are these situations in Kosovo and in Donbass, are they comparable?
They're not comparable in any way. So you can go through the whole history of everything here and there's not a single parallel. So first off, with Kosovo, you have Serbia invading with military forces, paramilitary forces, conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing and trying to force out part of the population. That's actually what Russia has done in Donbass. They invaded Ukraine, the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. The pre-war population was about 4 million. They pushed out about 2.5 million people who they claim to be protecting because they speak Russian. They've actually forced out all of these Russian speakers from Luhansk and Donetsk. They claim to be protecting people of Mariupol, who they slaughtered. More than 20,000 civilians, Russian-speaking people, killed by the Russians in Mariupol. So Russia is doing what Serbia did in attacking Kosovo. It has nothing to do with the international community after Serbia's ethnic cleansing in Kosovo trying to stop it, trying to stop the war. And what's now happening is, unlike Kosovo, which could not defend itself, Ukraine can defend itself. And it is defending itself. For 8 years, it just held a ceasefire line with the Russians in eastern Ukraine. But when Russia launched a new invasion now in February against all of Ukraine, they fought back, they've pushed the Russians back. Now the Ukrainians are determined to push all the way back. And when you look at the recognition of Kosovo as an independent state, if you remember, Serbia's war against the people of Kosovo was stopped in 1999. And then you had a long period of time where various efforts were made to try to find a final status for Kosovo acceptable to all sides. There was the Ahtisaari proposals in process. There was a three-party process of the US, EU, and Russia, where we each had an envoy, Frank Wisner for the US and Wolfgang Ischinger for the EU, and someone from Russia, and they tried to negotiate a solution. We had efforts in the United Nations to negotiate a solution. We had direct contacts between Kosovars and Serbs. And it was only after, I believe, to have to do my math, I think 7 years of trying to find a solution that eventually people said there is no solution possible, and Kosovo itself declared independence. Again, nothing like the situation of Russia invading Ukraine, putting up its own puppet government, and then very quickly turning that around and saying, okay, now it's an independent state and we recognize it. It is a cynical and frankly not very sophisticated misuse of history to try to claim that there's any parallel here.
Now, speaking of parallels, do you see any parallels between Russia and Serbia when it comes to their attitude towards their smaller neighbors?
Unfortunately, yes. Now, Serbia, it invaded Croatia and Bosnia and committed ethnic cleansing, and a lot of similarity to what Russia is doing now, whether it is taking pieces of Ukraine or taking pieces of Georgia or continuing to occupy parts of Moldova. Serbia has moved on from the active warfighting phase, but there is still a chauvinism that you get from Serbian nationalism in some ways, which is still disruptive of the sovereignty and independence of some of its neighbors, including Montenegro, but we particularly think about Kosovo. And we worry very much about efforts to destabilize Bosnia by supporting an independent Republic of Srpska. So this pressure from Serbian nationalism continues to have a negative effect in the region.
And what about the church? Are there parallels between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Church of Serbia, and how they are instrumentalized?
Exactly. That's exactly the word I was going to use, that the Russian Orthodox Church is not independent. It is being used by Putin and the Kremlin as an instrument of Russia's hyper-nationalist aggression against its neighbors. Take the case of Ukraine. Ukrainian Orthodox Church was an independent Orthodox Church, older than the Russian Orthodox Church, independent for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was at one time in history integrated into the Russian Orthodox Church when the Russian Empire took over Ukraine. When Ukraine regained its independence, Ukrainians said, we want our church back too. We're not satisfied having Moscow be our gateway to God. We want to have our own church back. And the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in Istanbul granted autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Very similar situation to Montenegro, where you had an independent Montenegrin Orthodox Church, 4 centuries, was in relatively recent history integrated into the Serbian Orthodox Church. But now that church is being instrumentalized by the government of Serbia as an instrument of Serbian national policy. And they even provide assistance from the Russian Orthodox Church to the Serbian Orthodox Church in order to facilitate that. So it is troubling that religion is being used as an instrument of national power and national agendas. As you know, in the United States we have a very firm rule of separation of church and state, because not all people belong to the same religion, not all people want the same things imposed on them. It is fine for people to choose their religion, to want to be Serbian Orthodox, of course, or to want to be Catholic, or to want to be Muslim. That's people's choice. But there shouldn't be a church that is instrumentalized as a part of state policy, especially in order to advance state interests against its neighbors.
Well, speaking of the ways Serbia can exert pressure on its neighbors, we have the Open Balkans Initiative, and some have characterized it as a step in the wrong direction when it comes to the to the road to the European Union for the Western Balkans countries. But they have also characterized it as fertile ground for nationalist ideas such as Great Serbia and Great Albania. What is your opinion on that?
First off, there's only 2 real games in town, if you will, if you're talking about Europe. It's NATO and the European Union. These are the institutions that are big and that matter, that set the economic and regulatory and political standards for Europe, or that set the security standards and cooperation for Europe. So doing something other than aiming towards NATO and the EU is not really helping the people of the country or the region in the long term. That's one thing. The second is the instruments of the Open Balkans Initiative are good. The idea of open trade, free movement of people, free movement of goods, cooperation among states, these are good things. This is what everyone should want. But they have to be done in a way where they don't protect the failure to resolve political problems in the region. So the reason why these are popular in some quarters is because it takes the pressure off from what do you do about an independent Kosovo? Serbia has to come to terms with an independent Kosovo. Are all countries in the region equally included in this free movement of goods and people, or is it selective? And why is it selective? So these are good instruments. I don't think anyone can say that free movement of people and goods and trade is a bad thing, but it has to be done on a basis that is inclusive, respectful of everybody in the region, and ultimately bringing the countries into the EU and NATO.
And how do you view the position of the new government in Montenegro in regards to what we have been talking about and the Open Balkans Initiative? Because there seem to be some opposing stances in the new government.
I think the Prime Minister's position on this is very clear. He's supporting it. He's supporting it for the reasons, at least as I heard him say, that he doesn't want to be an obstacle to regional cooperation. He wants to support regional cooperation. And that's a laudable goal. I understand that perspective. At the same time, I think that even this initiative is being instrumentalized, for instance, by the government in Serbia in order to avoid dealing with the political issues that they need to deal with, avoid dealing with Kosovo as an independent state, and avoid dealing with NATO and the EU as the principal direction of integration.
That leads me to our last question today. Speaking of the new government in Montenegro, what are your expectations, especially when it comes to the road toward the EU?
Thank you for asking that question, because I think this is one of the most important things that people have yet to internalize in Europe, but it will happen. And that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the brutality and the war crimes and everything that's part of that, has set in motion some fundamental changes. Europe, the EU, was largely asleep, largely fatigued on enlargement. The US largely disengaged, wanting to pivot to Asia. Everyone thinking that these problems are here, but we don't have to take them too seriously. That's all changed. Russia will emerge from the war with Ukraine as a diminished state. It will have a weaker military. It's already about a third weaker than it was. They'll probably knock out over half their combat power before they give up. It will emerge reduced economically. 10 to 20% cut to GDP this year because of the sanctions, more on top of that next year. Europe is making moves to stop buying Russian oil. That'll happen this summer, minus Hungary. They're talking about cutting off Russian gas. That is further down the road. I think they're serious now, but we'll see how that plays out. But Russia will emerge, and Russia will be a pariah state. And it'll be subject to these sanctions and international isolation for as long as Putin is in power, as long as their forces occupy parts of Ukraine, and as long as their war crimes have gone unpunished. So that's Russia. Second, Ukraine emerges as an independent, sovereign, secure European democracy. This is fundamental. Ukraine was not seen that way as recently as 6 months ago in Brussels. It was viewed as complicated, post-Soviet, hopelessly corrupt. That's not the perception of Ukraine anymore. The perception is a people and a country that are European, that are fighting to defend themselves and have as much right to be part of Europe as anybody else. Third, as we talked about, Finland and Sweden are joining NATO. What they are saying by joining NATO is it's not safe to be a neutral country in Europe anymore. These are the two most powerful neutral states in Europe. Sweden has been non-aligned for 200 years, and they're now saying, having watched Russia's aggression and the war crimes and the attacks on civilians, not anymore. It's not safe. We have to be part of the only alliance that does provide protection, which is NATO. This means that when you look ahead, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Kosovo, Bosnia, these countries must become part of NATO too. We can't have gray zones in Europe anymore. The gray zones are an invitation to mischief and violence, such as Putin's attacks on Ukraine. We can't have gray zones anymore. Third, European Union. The EU has already signaled that Ukraine will be a member of Europe. That is reviving the idea of EU enlargement. The same should happen in the Balkans as well. It should create an opening, an open window for Montenegro, for North Macedonia, for others, to say finally time has come. We have to start closing the political and economic gray zones as well and let these countries into the EU. No one can tell you what's the timeline, how does this work exactly, but I think if you look at these big forces that Russia's ill-conceived invasion of Ukraine have set in motion, this is the trend that's happening. And it is now urgent, frankly, that countries like Montenegro here in the Balkans, like Georgia and the Caucasus, they have to get ready. This is the time to do everything possible to prepare for membership in the EU in the case of Montenegro, NATO in the EU in case of Georgia, because this window is opening. It won't stay open forever. So it's time to move.
Well, Ambassador Volker, thank you so much for being a guest of Gradska television, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you.
Bilo je to još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Hvala na pažnji i ostanite uz program Gradske radiotelevizije.